Good evening. My name is Renee Nicholson, and as Director of the Humanities Center at West Virginia University, I am pleased to welcome you to tonight's lecture, Reproducing Inheritance, What Big Data Tells Us About Inequality in the Country Music Industry by Dr. Jada Watson from the University of Ottawa. In a moment, I'm going to turn things over to our colleague, Dr. Travis Steimling, to introduce tonight's guest. But before I turn things over, just a little bit of housekeeping. Today's talk is being hosted here on the Zoom webinar platform, and probably all of you are already familiar with Zoom webinar events. And then tonight, I'm just going to invite you to ask questions for our guest using the Q&A function. At the end of the presentation, Travis will do his best to answer questions as time allows, and only the answered questions will be made public. Our chat function is not enabled for participants. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Travis Steimling.
Thanks, Renee. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Travis Steimling, and I'm an Associate Professor of Musicology in our School of Music here at West Virginia University. Excited to see a nice crowd out for a talk that's going to be given by really one of my dearest friends in scholarship and outside of the business as well, Dr. Jada Watson. We've been trying to get her to campus for some time, and lo and behold, through the miracle of Zoom and with the support of the Humanities Center, we're able to get her here for us virtually. Dr. Watson's work is well known on our campus. My students definitely read her work frequently, and I think you'll be interested in what she has to share today. Her work consistently challenges the power structures that govern the country music industry in Nashville. And she has really since the very beginning of her work, beginning with groundbreaking work on the political fallout of Chick's lead singer Natalie Maines and her statements about George W. Bush, and continuing through her ongoing project SongData, which just last week published a report on the ways that the country music industry has redlined the boundaries of country music, keeping BIPOC artists out of playlists across North America. This most recent work, which will be the subject of her talk this evening, has led to substantive policy changes at individual radio stations and at the cable television network CMT, and has been covered in numerous national and international media outlets. Dr. Watson is an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, where she teaches courses on research methodologies, music and science, and popular music culture in the School of Music. She also teaches in the School of Information Studies and in Digital Humanities. She holds a Ph.D. in musicology from Université Laval and a Master of Information Studies from the University of Ottawa. Her research focuses on the development of genre cultures and communities, with an interest specifically focusing on on issues related to gender, race, class, identity, and sexuality, politics, and the environment. And she's published a lot of work, which I won't cite all of it here, but I will point to particularly two pieces that I'm really fond of. One that she published in my Oxford Handbook of Country Music, which I encourage you all to read, as well as a pretty significant contribution to the Cambridge Companion to the Singer-Songwriter. She has two book projects that she's currently working on, one of which we're going to hear about today in her talk. Dr. Watson's talk this evening is titled Reproducing Inheritance, What Big Data Tells Us About Inequality in the Country Music Industry. Please make welcome Dr. Jada Watson.
Wow, thank you so much, Travis. Thank you for the invitation to be here and for that introduction. I really wish I was with you in person, but I'm also very grateful to have this opportunity to be with you virtually to talk about the value of using big data in humanities-based research. I'm just going to start my PowerPoint. Here we go. In 2018, I launched the SongData project, a research program that seeks to harness the potential of big data to learn more about the ways in which popular music genres formed and evolved over time. But let's start with the big question of what is big data? Big data is often used to refer to any data set that is difficult to manage using traditional database systems. It's also used as a catch-all term for any collection of data that is too large to process on a single server. Yet others use the term simply to mean a lot of data. And sometimes it turns out it doesn't even have to be large. So what exactly is big data? A precise specification of big is elusive, as you can see. What is considered big for one research or industry may be small for another. What is large scale today might likely seem small in the near future. A petabyte is the new terabyte. Thus, size alone cannot specify big data. The complexity of data is an important factor that must be considered. Most now agree that the characterization of big data uses the 3 V's coined by Doug Laney of Gartner. Volume, referring to the vast amounts of data that is generated every second, minute, hour, and day in our digital world. Velocity, the speed at which data is being generated and the pace at which data moves from one point to another. And variety, the ever increasing different forms of data that data can come in, from text to images to sound. So, what does this mean for a music industry context? Well, we usually think about big data in terms of social media, smart sensors, satellites, surveillance cameras, and countless other devices. Big data, to me, lies at the heart of the music industry and has, since the beginning of the genre, in form of record sales, Billboard popularity charts, radio airplay, digital sales, and today's streaming. The industry has always had an eye to what data tells us about the marketability and profitability of an individual artist or group, about a change in recording style or sound, and so much more. But just as data is used to promote and support, it can also be used to make business decisions that deny opportunities and resources to artists. Sometimes this is based off of a response to an artist's song. Others, it's based off of market research toward a whole group of people. I'm generalizing a bit here, but the point is that for nearly 100 years, the nearly 100-year history of the popular music industry, data has been used to make decisions. So what if we, as researchers, use that data to learn about what types of decisions have been made? Enter SongData. I was curious about what data could tell us about music genres. How might discographic metadata help us better understand a genre's history? How can we explore this type of data to discover how and when genres form, develop, and change? How might biographic metadata of the artists teach us about a genre's origins, community, and culture? Who's participating in the genre? When and how often? These are the types of questions that guide my research today. So today I'm going to speak with you about my most recent research project, which Travis mentioned, which is working to unpack the role that data plays in upholding and maintaining inequities that persist and have persisted since the very beginnings of the industry in the 1920s. And that's where we're going to start our journey today. The popular music industry developed in the 1920s along a musical color line that echoed Jim Crow segregation. Even though black and white musicians played and listened to the same music, when record executives developed their marketing categories for records in the 1920s, they created 2 categories, hillbilly music and race music, through which they would market music to white and black communities, respectively. While these specific marketing categories are no longer used today, replaced over time with country and soul or R&B, the racial segregation established in the 1920s has been reinforced through the development of radio and recording industries, the centralization of the music business in Nashville in the 1950s, and the development and continued maintenance of industry popularity charts. These practices are deeply interconnected and continue to be perpetuated today through the ways in which labels sign, promote, and support artists, and in the algorithms that underpin streaming services. Despite the industry's multiracial and multi-ethnic roots, and the fact that the industry's most celebrated white stars were heavily influenced by black musicians, the industry's historic whitewashing of the country music narrative continues to center the voices of white artists. But it wasn't just the popular music industry that was founded along these segregationist lines. Public broadcast radio also developed in the 1920s. In fact, last year it celebrated its centenary. And research on radio has shown the extent to which radio programmed along similar color lines. In Selling Radio, Susan Smulyan indicates that broadcasters kept black entertainers off airways for fear of offending white audience members. She states, quote, radio station managers in the 1920s were afraid of alienating white racists, banned music they considered black from the airwaves, end quote. The institutionalization of whiteness by the country music industry has had far-reaching impacts on this cultural space. As Karen Pittleman has written, segregation has been maintained through outright appropriation, discrimination, and genre policing. Discussions about authenticity have historically served to create barriers for Black, Indigenous, and artists of color who are put in a position of defending their place in the genre. Embedded in this discussion are debates surrounding traditionalism versus country pop leaning sound, the use of hip hop or trap beat influences, or R&B sounding vocals, which contribute to the ongoing policing of boundaries within the genre. At the core of this discourse is a debate about who is or who is not permitted to create country music, which dictates the decision making of gatekeepers that control access to resources and opportunities within the industry. These were precisely the issues at play in reactions to Beyoncé's performance of Daddy Lessons on the stage at the 50th anniversary of the Country Music Association Awards, and the later rejection of that song by the Grammy Country Committee. It was also exhibited in Billboard's decision to drop Lil Nas X's Old Town Road from Hot Country Songs because it, quote, did not embrace enough elements of today's country music to chart in its current version, end quote. These constructs are just some of the ways in which the industry defines and continues to maintain its legacy of whiteness. But this is not just evident in historic racial inequity on country format radio and label rosters, but also in the development and maintenance of criteria used to determine eligibility for nomination to the industry's awards and honors. Awards like those granted by the Country Music Association and the Academy of Country Music reflect the state of the industry and are a visible marker of the absence of BIPOC artists from the industry's mainstream. These awards use a variety of performance indicators to determine eligibility, including the use of criterions such as radio airplay as a marker of artistic merit. But this is a colorblind approach determining eligibility, as it ignores the role that industry practices play in excluding BIPOC artists from full participation in the industry. Deeply connected to these structural issues are other forms of oppression that have likewise served to limit and exclude artists from participation in the industry. Sexism, homophobia, and transphobia are critical to any discussion regarding representation within the industry. Sexism has been at the fore of public debate within the industry for at least 6 years, with data-driven studies that explore the declining presence of female artists in the genre. In my own work, conducted in consultation with a women's advocacy group named Women Nashville, we found, when looking at radio airplay from 2000 to 2018, here we go, that there was a 66% decline in the percentage of songs by women within the top 150 songs on the year-end charts. And so in this slide, you see that gray represents male artists, purple represents female artists, and yellow represents male-female ensembles. And we'll just zoom in now on distribution of songs by female artists to see what that 66% decline looks like. So we see that from in 2000, there was 33.3% of the songs within the top 150 were by female artists, declining to 11.3% by 2018. And then when we translated that over to airplay to think about how often these songs were played, we found a considerable decline in airplay as well. Those songs declined from 32.6% of the airplay in 2000 down to 9.2% by 2018. As I continued to do this work, I found that in 2019, no matter which marker I looked at, female artists represented just 10% of country music radio. Oops, sorry, I should also say that in 2018, the ratio of spins was 9.7 to 1 in 2018. So for every about 10 songs by a male artist, you get one by a female artist. And so now we move to 2019 and look at and see what that year looked like. Female artists received 10% of the daily spins, which translated into 10% of the top 20 songs, 10% of the top 10 songs, 10% of the songs on the year-end charts in general, and 10% of the annual spins. But as I kept working on the data beyond this study that I published last February, I began to realize the depths to which this reflected just one part of the problem. What I was realizing as I analyzed the data was the extent to which, or the ways in which, the system was marginalizing BIPOC artists. to better understand how these, so I continue this work to better understand how these oppressions reinforce each other through industry policies and practices. So last week I published a study called Redlining in the Country Music Industry, and the color scheme has changed. So for the slides from here on out, we'll be looking at gray representing white artists, black representing black artists, yellow representing artists of color, which brings together data for Indigenous, Hispanic, and Latinx and Filipino artists, and red for multiracial and multi-ethnic ensembles. So in our time together today, I want to discuss the first steps that my research is taking in an effort to address these issues that centers race and ethnicity alongside gender and sexuality to better understand representation within the industry. This project draws on data sets that document weekly radio airplay, label rosters of Sony, UMG, and Warner Nashville, as well as the nomination histories of CMA and ACM awards over the last 2 decades. We're going to look at how industry practices impact the careers of BIPOC artists. And by using data or big data generated from these 4 industry spaces, we'll explore the impact of internal decision-making processes of those in power and consider how these actions oppress BIPOC artists, especially women and LGBTQ+ artists within the system. It's imperative to recognize, sorry, I'll go back here for one moment. It's imperative to recognize from the outset that combining artists that are not white or black together in one category is not ideal. Using one term to draw together artists of several ethnicities might be read as an attempt to reinforce the hierarchy of racial importance by positioning white and black artists as a standard and biracial, Indigenous, Hispanic, or Latinx, and Filipino artists as an exception. This decision was not taken lightly, but it was taken in order to ensure coherent and consistent analysis across all 4 data sets. More importantly, because there's such little airplay for songs by biracial, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latinx, and Filipino artists in the dataset, collapsing these categories together meant that their contributions would be visible within the results. It's also important to note that many of the artists of color were white passing. As will be seen by the findings presented here, both black artists and artists of color, even those that are white passing, have been severely underrepresented in the industry, to the point where their data is often not visible in the graphs. Over the last 19 years, 2,164 artists have had songs played on country format radio. The overwhelming majority of the artists with songs played in this period, 96%, were white, and only 3% were black. Were black, Indigenous, biracial, Hispanic, X, or Filipino artists, and 1% were multiracial or ethnic ensembles and collaborations. This figure includes 103 non-country artists whose songs were played on the format. So when we remove those from the list, this results in a reduction of the percentage of BIPOC artists from 3% overall down to 1.5%. And as a result, increases the representation of white country artists from 96 to 98%. Songs by just 13 black country artists were played on country radio in this period, while those by 1 biracial, 5 Indigenous, and 9 Hispanic, Latinx, and 1 Filipino American artist also had songs played. 20 are men and just 9 are women. The key findings summarized on this slide reveal that at every level of analysis, percentage of artists signed to major labels, of unique country artists on radio, of songs played, of airplay received, of charting songs, and of those with award nominations make up less than 4% of commercial country music industry. Black LGBTQ+ artists make up an even smaller percentage of the population. Just 1 Black queer artist has had a song played on the format, and he received just 0.001% of the total airplay. The 19 years examined in this study can be divided into 3 periods defined by activity for songs by BIPOC artists. And the key findings hold true at all levels, whether we're considering the number of songs played, the amount of spins or airplay received, and the number of songs that charted. But we're just going to look at airplay today. So when we look at this slide, we see that there is an increase in airplay from 0.3 to 4.8% across the 19 years. But I see 3 periods of activity. From 2002 to 2007, BIPOC artists are nearly absent from the format, with just 5% of the songs played and a 3%, sorry, not 5%, 0.5% of the songs played and 0.3% of the airplay. From 2008 to 2013, representation increases just marginally to an average of 1.5% of the songs played, with for an average of 2 to 2.5% of the airplay across the period. From 2014 to 2020, representation increases again to the final 6 years, and it averages about 3.7% of the songs played and 4.8% of the annual airplay. Even though we do see an increase across this period, both in terms of the number of songs played and the airplay for those songs, this increase was exclusively for songs by 3 BIPOC men. Over the course of this period, BIPOC artists received just 2.3% of the overall airplay. 3 BIPOC men accumulated 95.7% of the airplay for all BIPOC artists, while all other BIPOC artists, 26 of them, received the remaining 4.3% of this airplay. BIPOC women, by comparison, received just 2.7% of those spins across this period, including spins for non-country BIPOC artists. Within the broader picture of radio, when considering airplay for all artists, BIPOC women were responsible for just 0.4% of the songs played on the format and received 0.06% of the airplay over this period. The one Black LGBTQ plus artist was responsible for 0.001% of the songs played. When we drill into this data to examine the distribution of spins across the 24-hour radio cycle, it's critical to understand this because representation within representation on the on format, as it offers information on when an artist is most likely to be heard by listeners. The 24-hour cycle on terrestrial radio is divided into 5 day parts. The morning is 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Midday is 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Afternoon is 3 to 7 p.m. Evening is 7 p.m. to 12 a.m. And the overnights are 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. According to a Nielsen study in 2019, 42% of most radio listeners occurs during the morning and afternoon drives, with 21% each. And that 26% occurs in the midday. But these are often times of the day with the fewest songs played. As such, examining how much airplay songs by BIPOC artists receive according to day part helps us to see when their songs are played and how likely they are to be heard by listeners throughout the day. While it's true that most spins for all artists occur in the evenings and overnights, this distribution practice is more critical for artists that are underrepresented within the industry, as it offers fewer opportunities for their music to be heard by listeners. This is especially critical for BIPOC artists, especially women and LGBTQ+ artists who are attempting to break into an industry with historically and structurally discriminatory practices. This practice of relegating the bulk of airplay for songs by BIPOC artists into the evenings and overnights is what I've described elsewhere as cultural redlining, as an act of pushing artists of color to the outer margins of the daytime. Not only does this practice ensure that BIPOC artists won't be heard by radio listeners, but it also serves to uphold and maintain the racial framing of the genre that privileges the music of white artists by placing their songs in primetime programming. This then has implications across all other facets of the industry, as airplay does not then translate into chart activity, which renders their songs ineligible for awards. BIPOC artists, as I said before, received 2.3% of the airplay between 2002 to 2020. But this study finds that airplay for songs by BIPOC men increases, especially from 2007 to 2020, while airplay for songs by BIPOC women decreases. Songs by BIPOC country female artists are nearly absent from radio for most of this period, with almost no airplay between 2006 to 2016, 2002 to 2006, and extremely limited airplay from 2007 to 2020. So these pie charts show us the distribution of airplay in the evenings and overnights for BIPOC women. And so in 2008, BIPOC women received 0.5% of the annual airplay, 25% of which was in the evenings and 38% of which was in the overnights. In 2015, BIPOC women received just 3.3% of the airplay, 20.5% of which fell in the evenings, and a significant 48% fell in the overnights. And in the final year of the study period, 2020, airplay for BIPOC women dropped again to an average of 0.01% of the airplay, and the majority of which occurred in the evenings, 27.1%, and in the overnights, 43.6%. Graphing distribution by current and recurrent status provides an important lens into how much and how long songs by BIPOC artists factor into radio programming. Current songs are those that are new releases to radio and are vying for contention on airplay charts. Recurrent songs are those that have peaked and exited the weekly airplay chart, but are maintained in a station's recurrent playlist for continued playing. These also include songs that are retained as part of a station's back catalog of gold songs. With such little support from country format radio and songs that peak almost entirely outside of the top 20, songs by BIPOC women are absent from recurrent and gold rotation status. Why does this distribution matter? While radio airplay has the potential to introduce an artist and to provide support for their music to enter and climb charts, which is then tied to other opportunities in the industry, the retention of songs as part of a station's back catalog is just as important to contributing to the longevity of an artist's career. This means that once their songs peak and exit the chart, that those songs are retained for continued play in the future. More critically, this is part of a canon building process within the industry, as the songs retained within a station's gold catalog of songs become not just recognizable for audiences, but they're also foundation building to the culture and sound of a genre. This data shows that songs by BIPOC women are eliminated from playlists once their songs exit the chart, if they even chart at all. And within a year of their chart debut, their songs are absent from weekly playlists. This type of programming then serves to reinforce the white racial frame, or what Karen Pittleman refers to as the white sound of the industry. So, echoing the trend outlined above for radio airplay, representation on the charts also increases from 0.3% between 2002 to 2007 to an average of 1.5% between 2008 and 2013, and up to an average of 2% between 2014 and 2020. Over the course of this 19-year period, just 19% of the songs by BIPOC country artists peak within the 50 position weekly charts. And so this graph is a bit complicated, I realize, but it's the frequency of songs by their peak position. So it's looking at all the songs that were played on radio in this period, and graphs them according to whether or not they peaked in the top 10 or the top 20, the top 30, etc. The red line draws the market where the chart ends, and so we can see all of the songs that peak outside of that 50 position chart. And so just 19% of the songs by BIPOC artists peak within the chart, and the other 81% peaks outside of it. Here too, as above, most of the songs were by 3 BIPOC men, with just 3% of the songs by BIPOC women, by 3 Black women, 3 Hispanic or Latinx women, and 1 by an Indigenous woman. Just one of these songs peaked within the top 20 of the weekly airplay charts, and it remains to this day the highest charting song by a BIPOC woman in the country music industry, and that was Crystal Shawanda's song in 2008, which reached number 19. Linda Martell, who reached number 22 in 1969, remains the highest charting Black female artist in the country music industry. While the results show that all BIPOC artists are marginalized within this space, BIPOC women have been the most oppressed within the format and have not had the support required to sustain a career in the industry. The results for representation on country format radio reveal the racial hierarchy that exists within the industry. Continuing to program in the same manner as they've been done historically within the industry serves to privilege and center the music of cisgendered, heterosexual white male artists. As a result, all other artists are pushed to varying degrees to the margins of the industry. Within this hierarchy, BIPOC artists, especially BIPOC women, fall below all white artists. The graph of distribution of spins for BIPOC artists reveals that Black men and multiracial male ensembles appear at the bottom of the ladder, but still well above Black women. Understanding the deep connections between these processes and the ways in which they work together to reinforce racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia is important to unpacking how the system upholds its historic white racial frame. Black women and Black LGBTQ plus artists are drastically underrepresented within this space, if not absent from this system. And it's critical to understand where efforts to make concerted change within this cultural system must begin. The results show the rate at which BIPOC and Black queer artists are pushed to the margins of the country music industry. That this level of inequity persists in the country music industry in 2020 at a time when multiracial and the multiracial and multi-ethnic roots of the genre are well known and readily discussed is a sign of the deep embeddedness of white supremacy within every realm of the industry's structures. The results reflect nearly a century of inherited practices from the days of Jim Crow segregation and an invested commitment to whiteness. What I see unfolding here is reminiscent of a form of what scholar George Lipsitz has termed the possessive investment in whiteness. Industry policy and collective prejudice have worked together to maintain what George Lipsitz calls a possessive investment in whiteness that is responsible for the racialized hierarchies that persist within the industry. Lipsitz's work maps well into the country music industry, where whiteness has historically had cash value. Whiteness accounts for the advantages that come to white artists and businesses who profit directly or indirectly from discriminatory programming practices. This is evident not just in programming, but also through inherited criteria that, quote, pass on the spoils of discrimination to succeeding generations. What emerges through this work is a deep form of cultural redlining that relegates the music of BIPOC artists, especially women, to the margins of the industry. While the concept of redlining has historically been used to understand how customers have been denied policies based on race and ethnicity, Sophia Imogen Noble has applied this term to our modern data-driven era, looking at the ways in which algorithms directly or indirectly use criteria like race, ethnicity, gender, and more to make decisions, assessments, recommendations, and even eligibility criteria. Much of her writing on technological redlining and algorithmic or data discrimination resonates in cultural spheres, where contemporary decisions are based on historic and discriminatory data. What is critical to understand is that the data supporting the decisions, assessments, and recommendations are human-made. They are the results of practices in the industry, not of an audience or market response to music. Redlining is most visible in the industry in the day parting of programming at country format radio and in the ranking of songs by their peak positions, with this chart here exactly. While one shows how songs by BIPOC women are pushed into the day parts with the smallest listening audience, the other offers a greater perspective on where they fall within the industry landscape. Not only are these songs very unlikely to be heard by a radio listener, but they're unlikely to test well with audiences as a result. And if testing is then used as a marker of placement within a station's playlist, these songs are even more unlikely to break into the top 30 of an airplay chart and to meet eligibility criteria for awards. These practices then play a significant role in the ACM's and the CMA's management and maintenance of industry awards. Rooted in the concept of excellence, awards and honors in the industry are bound within a framework that promotes a set of criteria designed with merit in mind. Chart rankings, radio airplay, digital media, live concert ticket sales, television and film appearances, songwriting credentials, and contributions to the industry are all taken together or separately as criteria for which an artist might be deemed eligible for nomination. Given the system outlined here for daytime programming, for recurrent retention and chart history, songs by BIPOC women are unlikely to meet the basic terms of entry for eligibility. how are the contributions of artists who do not have this type of support to be weighted in comparison to the white men and women in the industry who have access to opportunities and resources? The context of award criteria is particularly troubling when changes narrow the pool of eligibility for candidates. This is the case. This is the case with the CMA's May 2020 revision of eligibility criteria for Single of the Year. Instead of reaching the top 50 of Billboard's or Country Airchecks chart, which is already insurmountable for BIPOC women, the new criterion requires that a song reach the top 10 of these charts to be eligible for consideration. While narrowing the chart positions was done in an effort to diversify nominations to increase opportunity for women, the new criterion actually puts extra burden on BIPOC women, who have historically been disadvantaged by industry practices. Under this new criterion, not a single BIPOC woman in the industry's history would be eligible for a CMA nomination in this particular category. And the chart results for 2020 already show that if these eligibility criteria remain in force, a BIPOC woman will not be eligible for CMA Single of the Year category in 2021 and are unlikely to be eligible for any other award that requires a top 50 charting song. These same issues then ultimately impact the induction processes of the Country Music Hall of Fame and are of critical concern for the role that the institution plays in upholding and cementing the white racial framing of the country music story. Of the 142 inductions to date, 119 are white men, male ensembles, or industry representatives. 17 are white women or industry representatives, and 3 are male-female family ensembles. Only 3 of the artists inducted are BIPOC, all of whom are men and all of whom were inducted after 2000, with DeFord Bailey in 2000, Charlie Pride in 2005, and Marty Stewart in 2020. This is all thrown into stark relief when considering that Sunday, March 14th, 2021, marked a historic evening in which Mickey Guyton became the first Black female country artist to receive an industry nomination, and she did so with no support from country radio. The historic underrepresentation of BIPOC women in this industry doesn't just impact representation in the country industry, but it also radiates into the broader industry, which then impacts public perception of what it means to be country. The current practices render it impossible for a BIPOC artist to be considered equitably for opportunities in the industry or within any nomination process. These artists have not just been excluded from participation in an industry their ancestors formed, but their contributions have been forgotten or erased from a narrative that the industry has constructed. More critically, these artists are not even considered when these criteria are being reevaluated. The institutional inequities that exist within the industry do not just prevent merit-based success, they prevent contributions from being recognized. The actions of the music industry are commonly defined in business terms, but this domain is characterized by an uneven distribution of power in which the predominantly white male leadership allocates resources and opportunities to artists. Patricia Hill Collins' concept of the matrix of domination is really instructive for understanding the ways in which systems of power are configured, administered, reinforced, and experienced in the industry. In my previous work, focusing on industry domains via gender alone, I was working within the domains of discipline, hegemony, and interpersonal actions. And so when I talked about representation there, I focused on how the decline of female artists on radio playlists rippled through the disciplinary domain, resulting in fewer women on the industry charts, leading to their declining presence on labels and publishing rosters, and considered how agents responded to actions of others by upholding and enforcing practices that disadvantaged female artists in the industry. I then focused on how these discriminatory practices were circulated and reinforced in the hegemonic domain in a way that normalized the absence of female artists in the cultural space. This is most evident in the country music industry through the press and through networking of and educational events and platforms of radios, labels, and publishers. And then I considered how this led to the interpersonal experiences of women who were pitted against each other and denied opportunities within the industry. But this relationship doesn't account for BIPOC artists, notably women, whose music is redlined into the overnights and remains outside of the industry charts. By remaining within these domains, only the root of the problem gets overlooked. It is in the structural domain that we find the ways in which power and oppression are organized and codified through a series of actions that were taken in the 1920s to establish the radio and recording industries, and the ways in which those structures have been continuously redesigned through their development. These domains within the industry's matrix are interconnected, and agents within these spaces are constantly referring to the actions of other domains in their decision-making processes. One of the ways in which this is done is via the data that results from their actions. We rely on data as a marker of historical value, as an archive of a genre's evolution, changing dynamics, and canon of influential songs. The industry is inundated by various forms of data: weekly popularity charts, sales statistics, and streaming recommendations. In a world in which this constantly evolving and expanding data influences decision-making within the industry and impacts how labels sign, produce, and promote artists, discrimination embedded within data play a vital role in the broader cultural space of the genre. These data define their own reality and are used to justify their results. They reinforce pre-existing inequalities and discriminatory practices within the industry that rely on them. More critically, the business model repeats itself and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It encourages investment in whiteness because whiteness remains integral to upholding the identity politics that provides financial advantages. Data that this industry process generates are used to make contemporary business decisions. The historic exclusion of BIPOC artists means that there is no data to support the development of an artistic career of BIPOC artists within the industry. Instead of seeing their absence from the list of from radio playlists or from the list of potentially eligible artists for an award as a sign of a problem, the data gap has served instead to justify and maintain industry practices. As Sarah Ahmed states, quote, "This is how inheritance is reproduced." The white patriarchal industry has, as Ahmed states, quote, "inherited practices that make these exclusions for them. Without them, decisions that mark edges, marking out where they do not have to go," end quote. Through the various industry actions that work to maintain and uphold this white narrative, the industry further cements the mechanisms that ensure the persistence of that structure, holding on to, investing in, and reproducing its inheritance. Thank you.
And thank you, Jada, for a fantastic talk. We have lots of questions already in the Q&A, and I'm sure if you do have other questions, please put them down into the Q&A box, and I will do my best to kind of filter and paraphrase questions as they come through, if that's okay, Jada, because we have some walls of text. First, thanks for a great talk that shows really how you've been able to use data to help us confirm hunches that those of us who work in the country music industry, both as scholars and as practitioners, we've kind of known these things are going on, but you've been able to provide a lot of data for that. So some questions that have come up. One of the questions here is really how much of the data that you've been using is based on redlining versus potentially selection bias. That is, the questioner asked, how much is the industry preventing BIPOC artists from entering the market versus BIPOC artists choosing to not be to not show an interest in or try to participate in country music?
Yeah, that's a really great question and a really hard one. Unfortunately, because of the data that I'm using, I'm looking at what did get airplay, the artists that did get signed, or the artists that were or were not nominated. So what I don't see in this data are all the efforts made on the part of BIPOC artists to try. So I don't know how many artists had meetings with labels and were turned down. I know from some conversations that I've had But that's sort of an unquantifiable part of this process that is really unfortunate. So, and the more that I dig into this, and the more artists that I'm fortunate to meet, I am finding that more and more there have been countless Black artists, or Hispanic or Latinx artists, Indigenous artists who have been turned down by the industry. Quite often they hear, we just don't know how to market you, or other variations of that. So it is a bit tricky, because I think there also is a segment of the creative industry where there are BIPOC artists who make country music but who don't have a desire to go towards the mainstream because of this perception that it is a white only space. So it is really tricky. And if I could get my hands on other data, it would really flesh out this picture so much to give us a better sense of what's really happening on the inside.
Yeah, and I would draw attention a couple. It was been I think 2 years ago now. You hosted a panel for our International Country Music Conference with people with women who had been in the industry going
Yes.
back to the 1960s, who had explained that there was a well-known fact that labels could only have one girl artist,
Yes.
right? And
Yep.
so that sort of gossip, rumor, kind of word of mouth conversations.
Yep.
It's hard to quantify. You're right,
Yep.
absolutely. Another question that we have here, actually from the same person, has to do with Lil Nas X
Yeah.
and thinking about kind of the musical identity of Old Town Road. And the question here is, is there a way for you to use big data to look at the similarities between a song like Old Town Road and other things that are on the charts and kind of help provide some sort of, I would say, maybe an older school kind of musicological style analysis kind of way of proving that Lil Nas X is actually just as country as the next artist. Is there a
Yeah.
way to do that?
I think there is. I don't even know that I would necessarily need data to do it so much as, I mean, if you listen to radio, songs like Florida Georgia Line's Cruise, or some of Jason Aldean's stuff, or even, I mean, we can go back to, um, my gosh, what was the song? LL Cool J and no.
That was LL Cool J and Brad Paisley, right? Isn't that accidental
Yeah.
racist? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that we can go back far, into the early 2000s and find hints of hip hop or trap beats that have been sort of swallowed into country music. And probably we could do a really interesting musical analysis of recording production, but also the beats, and instruments and rhythms that are used within all of these songs, and draw really strong comparisons between Lil Nas X and some of these songs, especially like somebody like Sam Hunt, whose music draws on these same sonic markers. Um, so yes, and maybe that's my summer project.
Yeah. So another question here: have you found any kind of correlation between a genre's race or gender demographics and the frequency of the RIAA's application of parental advisory explicit content warnings?
Mm. Ooh, I'm gonna read this one again. No, I haven't thought about that. I'm liking the example in movies. For example, a kiss between men tends to draw more restrictive MPA ratings than a kiss between a man and a woman. So I'm curious about how similar biases might play out in the country music industry in relation to album sales. That's a great question. It's funny, I don't know that the correlation would necessarily fall with album sales, but I think it would be with radio airplay. Songs that have been more progressive, I think of Casey Musgrave's music, um, sell well. There's an audience for music that represents different experiences than the white, heteronormative, cisgendered experience that is played on country radio. So my thinking is that it's not going to be with album sales or digital sales or maybe even streaming, but that it would be with um, radio airplay and the support that a label puts behind it so that it can have that radio airplay, and then it would sort of leap into representation in CMA and ACM nominations. But my hunch is that if we followed the sales and streaming trails, we'd actually find that those songs do well. Because
Yeah,
there's nobody policing it. There's nobody like putting a wall around it.
yeah. Yeah, not quite like the old days when they could ban Loretta Lynn for talking
Right,
about birth control, right? It's
right.
a little bit more of an open environment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another question here: in your research, did you find any anecdotal or qualitative evidence of tokenism? For instance, the industry pointing to, say, the 2 or 3 BIPOC artists who did receive some airplay as evidence of, things might be getting better or that they're changing.
Um, I'm trying to think if there was any kind of outright statement. I see the fact that 3 BIPOC men have had the 95.7% of the airplay for BIPOC artists as a huge sign of tokenism. I see it as very strongly reminiscent of the 1970s when Charlie Pride was getting the bulk of the airplay, but then there were others like Obie McClinton, Stoney Edwards who were getting some airplay. To me, when I line up the charts from that period with this period, they look the same in that regard, and it's really striking to feel like history is repeating itself a little bit. Um, I'm trying to think if I've seen any sort of outward. I mean, I guess the CMA Awards in November were a pretty outward display of tokenism in the way in which um, Charlie Pride was brought in to sing on the show with Jimmy Allen, and Darius Rucker hosted. And, um, I've said this before, but just 3 artists doesn't make diversity, especially if it's just 3 men and not bringing in women as well.
Yeah. And another question here, have you encountered any data about the business side of the industry and the presence or absence of women in the upper echelons of executive leadership? And here I would extend that to thinking about people of color as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have any data, but I do know, um, sort of anecdotally and from having been at a few industry events. I go to country radio seminar every year, so I'm fortunate to go to events where I see some industry representatives, and there are definitely white women who work within the industry, but they're definitely in the minority. Sort of the highest positions would be held by men. I'd say Leslie Fram at CMT is kind of an anomaly. Cindy Mabe at UMG as well. Um, and these are very, very much all white spaces. The Nashville Music Equality Group formed in the summer, and they've been spotlighting representation. And some of the individuals who are on the board of the NME are the only Black individuals that work within the labels and publishing rosters. And so it is, I sort of cut it out of this and just to make sure that we had time to talk, but there is like representation isn't just an artist thing. It's like in the writers' rooms, it's in the recording studios, it's the songwriters, the producers, the engineers, the road musicians, the studio musicians, anyone who works at a label, a publisher, any of the publisher like SoCan's Canadian, BMI, ASCAP, but everything from then hair and makeup, wardrobe, everybody. It's a very, very white space, and so that to me, it's not just sort of a perceptual problem at that level. It actually becomes an unsafe space for BIPOC and LGBTQ plus artists who are almost always the only one in the room, and then have to endure microaggressions while they're at work. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Right. I mean, I just start thinking about the story I think Diane Pecknold tells about Linda Martell going to cut a session and having a noose hanging from her microphone.
Yeah,
Right. I mean, this is one of the biggest black stars in country music. Right.
yeah,
And still who encountered that.
yeah,
And in my own work on the Nashville scene, which was recording with her at that time,
yeah,
there was one African American musician who
yeah,
worked over the course of 30 years. So
yeah.
it's not a new thing
No,
for sure.
yeah,
So if there are other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. But I have a question specifically. You mentioned Country Radio Seminar, which
yeah.
kind of drives the radio industry in the U.S. I don't know how influential it is in Canada. Um, but could you talk a little bit about kind of how you've taken this work, which is very data oriented and rooted in historical research as well, and turned it into work with industry, specifically thinking about your work going to CRS and meeting with people. I know you've done some workshops and things in Nashville, and you've also worked with CMT. So for people who might be thinking about like, what is the real application of this research,
yeah.
maybe you could share a little of that.
Yeah, so that's been a really interesting journey. And really, I've been very lucky along the way. My first piece on any of these issues was an academic piece. So hidden behind a paywall and not really out there for industry consumption. But it was found early on by a lawyer, a music lawyer in LA who works on radio. And she was working on a brief that was going to be submitted to the FCC when the NAB wanted to further deregulate ownership. So she grabbed hold of that article as like piece of her data evidence. And at the same time, I almost forgot about that story. It's been so long. Um, and then at the same time, I met a women's advocacy group named Women Nashville, and I started to work with them on some airplay reports. Actually, I don't know that I would have gone to airplay radio weekly reports if it wasn't at their suggestion. Um, and getting hands on that data has been sort of the best the best thing. And so we worked together to produce 3 public reports, um, and we just sort of followed a path of creating the reports and putting them out, sending them to journalists ahead of time before publication so that they could see them. And because with regards to representation of female artists, it was already sort of a big industry discussion. So the data came out at a time when it was really needed. And as a result, that led to CMT contacting me to see if I wanted to do a little bit of data work for their Equal Play campaign. I don't think they'd named it that at the time. I think they were just sort of figuring out what to call it. And I've been going to CRS for the last 3 years. Um, and for me, it's a great education to just be because it's an educational convention. So I go and I just sit and I take in like sessions on scheduling or sessions on data or sessions on marketing. And it's an invaluable lesson at what goes on behind the scene. And I've been very fortunate in those at CRS for the last 2 years. This year was virtual. So the 2 years previous, to meet some people that have just been really great at sending me things when they see them, and has led to opportunities to work with people in the industry. Um, One thing that was a very big surprise, because I work so niche on country music, and there's like this whole other world of like discussions about equity, diversity, and inclusion in other industries and other realms of the popular music industry. Was when the Recording Academy published its report on diversity and inclusion in the broader popular music industry. They actually cited the first radio report, which was a lovely surprise. So it was nice to know that it's being read, um, by those folks.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and thanks for sharing that model. Just sometimes putting your work out there in the right spaces and letting it live can do wonderful things. I'm going to have one final question from one of our students here, wondering how can consumers of country music help make these changes within the country music industry?
That's so hard. I love the question though. Um, so I think first and foremost, um, I think buying buying the music of and supporting new artists is always really important. A couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, I saw, I think on Instagram, an artist saying, like, every time my music is shared, it's like one more potential fan, and how important that is. So I think social media is actually like making significant changes right now. Um, Pandemic doesn't hurt either, actually, with everyone sitting on their computers all day. So we're sort of seeing new artists like at a faster click than before. Um, and so I think the first things to do are get to know new artists, follow them on social media, share the music you love, buy their music when you can. If you can't, stream. All of that helps. Not necessarily financially, but visibility is really important to move their music up in the algorithm. Um, and I think it's always worth checking in with your local radio station um, to request songs. It's possible they will play them. They likely won't play something that's not in their playlist, but if you keep asking, maybe they'll give it a shot for a fan who clearly wants it. Um, I don't know. It's a tough question because it sort of depends on what it is you aim to support. If you aim to sort of like support the artist, then I'd say buy and share. Um, and I think that's a great first step.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Jada, for a wonderful talk and for sharing your insights with us. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on campus. And I believe Renee has some closing remarks for us. But first, big thank you to Dr. Jada Watson.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and let me echo Travis's thank you. That was informative, enlightening, and important work, and I just so appreciate you sharing with us. And on behalf of the Humanities Center and the larger West Virginia University community, thank you. Um, and I just want to let our folks at home and tuning in that if you missed her workshop earlier today, Dr. Watson's workshop on using Excel is available through our Humanities Center YouTube channel. And please also look for announcements for upcoming Humanities Center events on our social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and at our website at thehumanitiescenter.wvu.edu. I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Travis Steimling. You did a great job facilitating tonight. I'd like to thank Dr. Jada Watson one more time. And I hope that sometime we might be able to bring you physically to campus. That would be lovely.
I'd love that. I really would love that.
We would too. So on behalf of our community, thank you to you. Thank you to all that tuned in tonight for attending, and to all, be well.